Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Loni Branon. I am a director in Informa Pharma Intelligence, and I am joined today with Michael Feitz and Otis Johnson. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Feitz. I'm a feasibility strategist with Bayer. Otis?
Hi, my name is Otis Johnson. I'm Vice President of Feasibility, Clinical Informatics, and Site Identification at ICON.
Thank you both. So I'm very pleased to have both Mike and Otis joining me today to present partner and shared expertise in technology to optimize study planning. During our presentation, we will review the key questions involved in the study planning process and how working together as sponsor, CRO, and pharma intelligence can bring in the right expertise, technology, and the best data to really help answer these core business questions and make the study planning process that much more successful. So in working with both Mike and Otis, we went through the study planning and protocol execution process and highlighted the 5 core business questions that need to be answered during this process. And those are listed here. So what countries have the greatest disease prevalence? What is the current standard of care? What is the average enrollment rate for similar studies? Where are the competitive trials and who are the sponsors currently running them? And where can I find the best, most experienced investigators who are not currently involved in a competitive study? So we will use a planned phase 3 industry-sponsored congestive heart failure study as our case study to work through these different questions throughout the presentation. So first, let's take a look at the overall congestive heart failure global prevalence. And using data from Data Monitor Healthcare, we were able to create this dashboard view to quickly and easily see where the highest prevalence rates are for congestive heart failure. So here we see that China has the greatest prevalence with over 14 million, for example. So this helps us with a directional approach of the countries we may want to start looking at for our planned study. Furthermore, in Data Monitor Healthcare, we can also focus in on our specific patient population of interest. So we're interested in reduced ejection fraction patients. And here we're looking at the disease prevalence for those patients within the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And we can quickly see that the US and Germany has the highest disease prevalence overall, mainly with the NYHA2 and NYHA3 classes. So again, these might be 2 countries that we may want to look at. So what about the standard of care for the countries with the highest disease prevalence? Again, in Data Monitor Healthcare, we have these dashboard views where we can quickly and easily filter to the patient populations of interest. So here we selected the US and Germany since those were 2 of the 3 countries with the highest prevalence for congestive heart failure. And we filtered down to reduced ejection fraction, NYHA classes 2 and 3, and looked at first-line treatment. And we can really see the variability across the 2 countries, with the U.S. having a little over 6% of patients on a combination therapy, whereas in Germany, there's a little over 6% of patients on candesartan. And that combination therapy that's common in the U.S. is only common in about 2% of patients in Germany. So this dashboard view and the dynamic filtering really allowed us to hone in on the patient population of interest and see the variation between the different countries and the treatments. In looking at the historical trial landscape for congestive heart failure, we identified the countries with 20 or more studies similar to our own planned phase 3 industry-sponsored CHF trial. So here we can see that the U.S. has the greatest experience running these studies with 32, followed by Germany and the UK with 29, and Italy with 28. There are 50 studies total, but we really wanted to hone in on those studies with the actual enrollment details. So that's what we did here. We took those 50 completed trials and using the TrialTrove API, created this dashboard view to only pull back those studies with actual enrollment details as publicly available to us. And there were 37 total trials. We can quickly see that the average enrollment duration is 31.7 months across these studies. The average treatment duration is 12.4 months. And then the average total trial duration was 44.1 months. We also have this scatter plot view where we can quickly identify where those studies, where the enrollment duration was in correlation with the treatment duration. So you can quickly see there are some outliers here of studies that had very quick enrollment and the treatment duration was longer, or enrollment duration that was longer and the treatment duration was shorter. So it might be helpful to review the protocol elements of these outliers to see how similar or how different they are to your own study. So what about the competition? Where are other sponsors launching studies, and will we have trouble recruiting for patients? Here is a view of the competitive trial landscape, so the ongoing and planned phase 3 congestive heart failure studies matching our protocol. There were 18 trials total across 62 countries. And using the TrialTrove API, we created this dashboard heat map view so that we could quickly see those countries with the greatest competition. The planned trials are in light pink and the ongoing trials are in dark pink. There's a chart with the start dates, so you can see the years that the ongoing trials started and then the anticipated start dates for the planned trials and how those planned trials may affect your upcoming study. Here's a chart showing the sponsors involved and the number of trials that they're running. So you will see that Novartis has 3 trials, followed by Bayer, Boehringer, DCRI, Lilly, and Pfizer, all with 2. We also included the target accrual totals across each of the studies, highlighting the patient demand for these competitive trials, giving a sense of the challenge that a sponsor may have conducting a similar study in some of the same countries where these active trials are currently being run. So once you've reviewed the competitive trial landscape and the countries with the greatest experience conducting similar studies, where are the experienced clinical investigators in correlation to those competitive studies? And how can we identify the best investigators for our trials who are not currently tied to a competitive study? So here is a dashboard view using our Citeline Investigator API, where we use the elements of our study protocol to identify the investigators in Citeline who have the greatest experience running these studies. So there were over 3,100 Citeline investigators broken out by tier using our investigator prioritization, which ranks investigators into 3 tiers. Tier 1 representing investigators with the highest probability to perform well in a given study compared to tiers 2 and tier 3. We focused here on the tier 1 and tier 2 results. Tier 1 can be found in yellow and tier 2 in pink. So we can quickly see that there's a high amount of experience, high density in Western Europe as well as the U.S. So we're able to zoom in on the U.S. as well as Western Europe to see the distribution that much easier and get a sense of where those tier 1 investigators are and where we may want to go for our study, as well as where the tier 2 investigators are across Western Europe and the Eastern Seaboard. So now we want to see where these investigators are in correlation with the competition. So in using the trials API, where we created the heat map view of where the competition was globally, we overlaid the tier 1 and tier 2 investigator results so that we can quickly see where the experienced investigators are in correlation with the competition and identify those countries with the least amount of competitive studies, but the greatest number of experienced tier 1 and tier 2 investigators, providing us with a directional approach of where we may want to go for our own study. So what about the patients? In using Trinetics data, we were able to review the number of patients in the U.S. that matched the different elements of our study protocol. So here we started with over 39 million patients across 36 healthcare organizations. And as we added in the different elements of the inclusion and exclusion criteria of our protocol, it began to funnel down the patient results, and we were able to see what criteria really impacted the number of patients available to us. Once we had our patient results and the locations of those patients, we identified 14 healthcare organizations with over 8,000 patients. But then we wanted to know, where are those patients in reference to the experienced investigators that we identified in the U.S.? So in taking the list of healthcare organizations in which the patients were located, we then used Citeline to identify the investigators who have the congestive heart failure phase 3 industry-sponsored experience and who were also located at the same facility. And that's what this view is here. So we use the Trinetics patient data along with the Citeline investigator data and the trial data, and using those APIs, pulled and mapped the data together into this dashboard view. So we can quickly see the number of healthcare organizations by state, and the heat map view is on a state level, so we can easily see the states that have the highest number of patients. And then we also have the investigators listed who are located at those facilities and potentially have access to that patient population. Furthermore, we wanted to filter out any investigators who are not currently tied to a competitive trial. So once we did that, we were left with 9 healthcare organizations and 27 site-driven investigators with access to over 5,800 patients. So here we have identified investigators with experience matching our study, patients who match our study as well, and made the connection of the investigators located at the facility where these patients are also located. So really helping to give that holistic view and provide an even more of a directional approach for your site selection process. So at this time in the presentation, I'll turn it over to Mike Seitz to begin discussing their process once they take all of this data and bring it in to their internal systems.
Thank you. As Loni mentioned, we use multiple sources of data, both internal and external, for our feasibility. And illustrated here in the different boxes here, you can see we source data from various vendors depending on what the needs of the project are. If we have more robust internal experience, we'll rely a little less heavily on some of the vendor data, and then vice versa. If we are able to exploit some of our vendor data, then we will leverage this depending again on the project needs. So we have various sources from CROs. We have electronic medical records that we also pull from. We do bring in some IRB data. All of this is tasked with trying to identify the most appropriate sites for the project. You can see that the data is then kind of brought into a performance dashboard. So we will look at the various specific data elements across the vendors to try and normalize it. And those typically weigh heavily on recruitment startup time, but typically we will pull in some screen failure rates and look at past performance from the investigators to again try and choose the most appropriate investigators for the project. As I mentioned, the rankings will be looked across all of the vendors, and then that will also be compared across our internal dashboards. So again, looking at if we have multiple vendors providing input and we see the frequency matching across investigators, we can look at what type of investigators may have a higher ranking across various vendors, and those will typically be the vendors that we classify as higher tiers to approach for the study. We also involve feedback from our country organizations, so they will have opportunities to review the data and provide input to those investigators as well. Again, looking at what the needs are for the program, but also what the needs are for the local organization. So we do allow the countries to provide feedback into various startup times, patient pathways, look at risks and opportunities across the country, because that certainly will weigh into our final selection of that country and eventually those investigators. This next slide will provide kind of an overview of what we do when we have all of the data. As Loni mentioned, we rely heavily on the sources and the outputs from both trial trove and site trove. So that data will really influence how we are making our final decisions. And you can see that in this overview, this is an example of where we have reached out to multiple countries. We're looking across the project expectations. So there's a column on the left that lists the study recruitment duration. So that's what we would plan for the project. And then we do bring in some theoretical data to try and project what we expect the recruitment rate would be for that country. This is typically pulled from incidence and prevalence data. And then we will assign kind of an overall expected recruitment rate. From this, we'll also look at the number of sites that we were able to pull from different data sources, and that would project our potential number of Tier 1, Tier 2 sites. So this gives us an idea of how many potential sites that we could expect to approach for feasibility, and again, give us a bit of an understanding of how reliable that data could be. So this gives us, again, kind of an overview of what the potential of that country would be. And we would assess the investigators through feasibility. So whether we do this with a questionnaire or more formal face-to-face discussions, that information will be collected. We'll evaluate those surveys in various tools, and that will also give us some more data to project onto this spreadsheet here. We will then, as I mentioned, involve the country, so the countries will be able to review the data from those investigators and put forth their expectation as to recruitment, as I mentioned, also risks and contingencies. So that will give us an overview of the country proposal. All of this will then get compared, and we will have various meetings to really determine what the overall potential of that country would be, as well have an understanding of what the recruitment rates for those various countries would be. This is really an interactive dynamic across the project team, the feasibility team, as well as the country organization, so that we will have a very strong understanding of the program, and then at that point be able to make decisions driving hopefully a successful program. With that, I would turn it over to you, Otis. And Otis, you may have to advance. I just got pushed off of this slide, so you might have to advance that on your own. Sorry.
Thank you, Mike. So as you saw and heard from Loni and Mike, a good feasibility process demands a thorough assessment of multiple data sources and information types to cover the breadth and depth of analysis needed for a sound feasibility strategy. This is a snapshot of key components of a sound feasibility strategy, with information ranging from incidence and prevalence, depending on which one you need for the opportunity, the competitive landscape, recruitment rate and patient per site analysis, modeling, country assessment, as well as site and patient access. Together, they cover the breadth of data needed, but must also have the ability to get granular, especially when evaluating and projecting the recruitment rate, because this is one area where it is really important to have the right, most closely matched studies for comparison. So over the next few minutes, I will show specific examples of how we bring these information types together to support the decisions we make on a daily basis around study planning. So our ability to deliver on expectations begins with a thorough assessment of the current landscape with the intent of navigating the competition. And by the way, competition is not always bad. Competition often means opportunity. And part of our process is to identify specific elements of the competitive landscape or the relevant trial environment that we can leverage for the study being planned. We start with a broad assessment, such as what you're seeing on the screen now, including sponsors and drugs active in the disease area and where they are in their development life cycle. But that's just the beginning. That's where it starts. We then identify the specific, most closely matched studies likely to compete with the current study we're planning and map them out on a timeline similar to the one you're seeing on the right of the screen to show where there's overlap and hence competition. We then use this information to craft our strategy to ensure successful on-time completion of the project. So in this example, all the studies competing directly for patients will be closed for enrollment at the time that the planned study starts or shortly after, except that one study in that bottom row, study number 5. That study is the major competition that we have, and we would spend more time trying to find out more specifics around that particular competitive trial to figure out how to navigate. So the prior slide is an example of our approach to feasibility research and analysis. We believe that transparency is key when working with sponsors. We therefore document our research and analysis in a dynamic web-based visualization tool, and we call that the FIT, or Feasibility Intelligence Tool, to give sponsors visibility into the data and analytics driving our operational planning decisions. The tool also gives us internal confidence that our staff are appropriately accessing all the different information types that are available to us, and there's some consistency in their approach to data analysis and presentation of the data. It has customizable dashboards and interactive algorithms. So for example, the user can adjust the weightings used to rank countries. And if you look on the right side of the screen in the middle, there are specific components of the rankings that you can assign weightings to, and the tool will dynamically update and change the countries that rank higher based on your selections and your decision on what is more important for country selection. The lower left of the screen has key information types captured in this feasibility intelligence tool and is aligned with the data types needed for a sound feasibility strategy, as we discussed on in my introductory slide. So this tool is used as the basis for the subject matter experts in an assigned team to discuss the data, apply their experience, and agree on the appropriate strategy with the data as that background for the discussion. And just to get a little bit more into the tool to give you an idea of the level of detail and insights you can get, the recruitment rate is one of those analyses that's universal, and you really need to dig in depth to really understand what your recruitment rate projection should be. So this is an example of a dashboard in this FIT tool, this feasibility intelligence tool, showing the various ways we evaluate recruitment rates before projecting what we expect the rate to be for a specific trial. The tool is dynamic and interactive. So as you can see on the right, there are sliders and checkboxes to narrow and expand the analysis as desired. It is a collaborative tool allowing sponsors to combine their data with ours for even more powerful insights. So we can take in data that a sponsor may have access to that we don't, and combine with our data set to create better insights. We also have the ability to provide access externally as well, so that sponsors can interact with the tool and make changes and see the impact on the analysis as those changes are made in real time. It gives us the ability to compare recruitment rates across patient segments. So in this example that we're using in congestive heart failure, there are different patient segments involved, and you can see the variation in recruitment rates across these patient segments, and can use this type of information to plan appropriately for patient recruitment. And then finally, we try to bring the whole analysis together, because the intent is not just to look at the individual parameters that go into what it takes to appropriately run a trial. It's really about how can you project timelines around the trial, how long it will take to get your trial recruited. So it's important to bring all the key elements together. And we do this through enrollment modeling using Monte Carlo simulation. And this modeling approach does not rely on midpoint estimates. It considers ranges and project enrollment with a probability of success. So it allows us to plan with more confidence to improve the probability of meeting timelines. So on the left of the screen, we have the key inputs that go into the model. And the way the model works is that it randomly chooses a value from the range for each input parameter, and it runs a virtual trial. So that blue line that you're seeing is a virtual trial. And if you run enough of these virtual trials, you will end up with an enrollment period distribution curve similar to the one that you see on the screen. And this is a curve that you can use to make your decisions around what the appropriate recruitment period should be for this particular trial, given the inputs that you have derived from your rigorous research and analysis. So in this particular example, this trial has a 10% probability of completing enrollment in 21 months. So that's that first vertical line. That's pretty aggressive and pretty risky. If you had more time, if you had 32 months, your probability goes up to 90%. And you could argue that 90% is conservative, but the key point is that this type of analysis gives you the data and insights needed for you to make that determination of what the appropriate recruitment period should be, depending on the risk you're able to tolerate for that specific opportunity. And then finally, one of the questions I usually get when I present our approach to feasibility research and analysis is how effective is the process and how good is it in delivering what you need? We have built the infrastructure to be able to make those assessments, where we document our projections and we track against actual as studies get completed. And without getting into a lot of details here, the key takeaway message on this slide is that the projected recruitment rate is a little bit higher than what happens in actuality, but not very far apart. The challenge with measuring this particular metric is that from the time that you begin an opportunity to the time that it gets started and is run and the study is complete, for you to have hard metrics in terms of predicted versus actual, is that it takes a very long time. So we built a tool with enough flexibility that we don't have to wait until the trial is complete to get a sense of how we're doing. As you can see on the lower right of the screen, you can choose to include in your analysis studies at different phases of completion, whether they're 25% complete, 50% complete, 75% complete, or 100% complete, to get an idea of how you're doing. And the whole purpose behind this is for us to have a feedback mechanism in place to refine our approach so that we can be more predictable. And with that, I'll hand it over to Loni.
Thank you, Otis. So as both Mike and Otis reiterated, it really is about the depth and breadth of data, and really starting with the core data set, your CTMS, and then bringing in as much data as you can to create that holistic view, whether or not that's the Citeline Informa data, EMR, publications, or other third-party sources. And then having the technology available to you to integrate the data, map the data together, and then create these analytics to filter and rank results as you see fit, prioritize and rank depending on the most important aspects to you. And then finally, of course, the collaboration part, sharing data, sharing knowledge, sharing expertise, having access to the same core data sets between you, but also being able to have those site selection discussions because you've done the work ahead of time, reviewing that data and having these discussions more successfully and more efficiently, allowing you to make the best, most accurate final site selection decisions in the end and hopefully speed up the overall process. So that does conclude our presentation for today. We want to thank you all for listening and for joining. I know there's a number of questions that have been coming in. Some have already been answered. Mike, are there any additional questions that need to be addressed at this time?
I think I've addressed most of them. No, nothing on my end.
Okay. Otis, were there any questions that came in that you wanted to speak to? That maybe you haven't already?
Yeah, I think I see a question here around recruitment rate. Is it a parameter taken into consideration during site selection only? Has that one been addressed?
It would be great if you could address it from your end of things. Yeah.
Sure. So the answer is no. So recruitment rate is a consideration from the beginning. From the moment you have a draft of the protocol, concept of the protocol, you need to be thinking about recruitment rate expectations, because that's going to drive how many sites you need, how many countries you need, and where you go. So that's a fundamental part of the initial upfront assessment to really scope out what it's going to take to operationally deliver the study. And then, of course, later on, when you get to site selection, you need to have an understanding of the rate at which the sites will recruit. And, of course, there will be differences in recruitment rates. So it's a key consideration from the beginning. And I'll also venture to say that even patients per site is also a key consideration, because it gives you an idea of patient access. It doesn't mean that if you give a site more time that they will always be able to enroll more patients. There is a limit, and understanding historical patient per site achieved in similar studies can really help you set appropriate expectations up front.
Thank you, Otis. It looks as though we have another question here. Is there such thing of ever having too much data, having it be hard to organize or map or assess? Maybe we can have Mike, maybe if you'd like to speak to that first, and then Otis.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think certainly looking at the data through the noise is something that we're always looking for, but trying to find the frequency in which you're getting similar responses is something that we're constantly striving for. So I haven't been exposed to a problem where I've had too much data, but certainly I think it could be in some indications where you may have a lot of mixed messages, but just ensuring that you're striving to find the appropriate type of common threads across all your data sets is something we're really trying to focus on. Otis, I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, sure. And so you are right, Mike. Actually, I would welcome that situation where we have too much data. Usually the problem is not finding enough information, especially in novel and rare disease, which is a question I just saw and I will address next. So I think it's just adjusting your approach A matter of fact, if we have a situation with a lot of data, it might mean that there's less variability in terms of the inputs that go into your model. And one of the ways that we have prepared to address the explosion of data that we're seeing is with the way we organize it, with the feasibility intelligence tool, for example, that we shared. That's one way that we ensure that we organize the data in a way that ensures that we're still focusing on what's important, despite the fact that we have a lot of data, and that we don't get distracted by extraneous data that's not going to help us with strategy. As it relates to novel and rare disease, that's where we have the opposite problem, where we can't find enough studies. And just to be frank, what we do in that case is we just have to be a lot more creative, because we often find that the traditional sources of data often just don't have exactly the type of information that we want. We might have to do some broad searches on the web. We may have to reach out to specific experts and advocacy groups to get information. And a lot of times the information is not as objective and quantitative as we would like. So we have to use a mix of some of the qualitative data that we get to really create the right strategy for those novel and rare diseases. And we're seeing a lot of those in recent times. And I see another question here. So Loni, let me know if I'm talking too much. I see another question here related to EMR. Do you want me to take that one?
Sure, yes, go right ahead.
Sure. So this question is around EMR technology. Are there systems or technology where you can use EMR in a robust way to recruit? So the answer is yes, but it's still an area that's in development. Most of the systems that are out there that I have come across, they were initially designed to support the upfront protocol assessment and to help you design a protocol that is targeting a realistic patient. So as such, we use them extensively in the feasibility space, and you have seen output from one example from TriNetX that Loni presented. But those tools are now in a phase of transition where they're pushing to support better patient recruitment, to actually get patients into trials. So TriNetX is one of them, and there are several others out there, some of them new companies that have formed to focus on recruiting patients into trials. But this is an area where we're going to see a lot of development over the next year or two, because there is opportunity to be a lot more targeted in our approach to recruitment, and with better ways to analyze EMR data, including making sense of physician notes, for example. We're going to see a lot better results in terms of using EMR to recruit patients into trials.
Thank you, Otis. It looks like there's one additional question from Catherine. Do you have metrics on how much recruitment prediction was optimized using these modeling approaches? Otis,
yes,
geared towards you, I think. Yes.
Sure, no problem. So that last slide we shared is just an example of an excerpt from our dashboard in terms of how we're tracking. I will provide, as a follow-up to this presentation, I will provide a link to a presentation on the effectiveness of these types of technology in really affecting recruitment metrics. We'll not share the details on the call now, but we'll send the link as a follow-up with published information on their effectiveness. The bottom line is, yes, they are effective.
Okay, thank you. Looks as though that's all the questions for now, but if anybody does have any additional questions, please do let us know. You can send questions to pharma@informa.com, and one of us will respond to you as quickly as possible. And again, I want to thank you all for attending today. I want to thank both Mike and Otis for working with me on this presentation and on this webinar. And I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon and evening.